Good evening, everyone. This is Skinny E Media, otherwise known as Mark, here to present you one of the greatest interview opportunities I could ever imagine. Here we have Henry Talbot is at the New Zealand Classification Office. Very important role indeed there. How do you do, Mr. Talbot?
Very well, thank you.
I'm doing great myself. I know in your line of industry, quite similar to the BBFC and MPAA, you often observe films and decisions on videos and video games being made that are suitable for the audience that it's intended for. The rating system in of itself is a very unique one for the audience who is a bit curious. The unrestricted categories, G, P, G, M, and then the restricted ones starting from RP13, RP15, 16, and then R13, R16, R18, and then R, which I think is one of the most interesting film classification labels I have seen, at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, it is. It gives us a lot of flexibility, that system. So it's been around for quite a while, those ratings now. And you'll get the more common ones like R16 and R13, or those unrestricted ones, which kind of have sort of equivalents in other systems you might be familiar with. And those RP ones we use less often, and that's really when there's, tends to maybe be something about a film that might have restrictable type content like sex and violence and so on, that might be hard for younger people and children, but there might be something about the film that makes it maybe important or worthwhile to have that opportunity if they have their parents with them or are able to talk through the issues that come up in a film.
Oh yes, absolutely. I would understand. I know in the US system, because I have grown up in both countries, you have the R rating, which in many ways acts like a similar sort of caveat. You can bring under 17s to see it, provided they have parental adult supervision. Britain has the 12A, but the 12A is more along your equivalent of like an M category. It's unrestricted with similar type of movies that get like a PG-13, but with the caveat that it's more appropriate for 16 and up. So yes, getting back to the questions more in hand, my experience is, in your line of work, how do you compare yourself to other countries involved? Because I know most of my mates, they seem to compare yourselves to Australia. Probably a little bit too much there, but through the variety of options that you have available, that's certainly not the case, particularly the R and the RP categories. And then also you just kind of decide what passes for. If it's an MA15, it could sometimes get like an R18 or an R6 to an R13, depending on how the Kiwi censors view it as such. I'll let you put your words.
Yeah, so there's obviously some key similarities and differences. The Australians will tend to use that MA15 very often, which is, in terms of what it's actually saying to audiences and to parents and so on, it's kind of similar to our RP, and we're more likely to use those kind of hard restrictions over here in New Zealand. In terms of the differences in how we make those decisions, there's lots of similarities between Australia and New Zealand and places like the UK, and similar concerns around things like sex and violence, for example. There are things that we kind of specifically take a lot of care on, that we know New Zealanders care a lot about here at our office, and particularly things like suicide and sexual violence. So those were a good example of that was 13 Reasons Why. So those were both significant plot points, and we did consult with mental health and sexual health experts when making the decisions. So it's a good example because, for example, with sexual violence, it was kind of a bit mixed. The depictions themselves were quite kind of high impact and potentially distressing, but the overall messages around sexual violences weren't necessarily bad ones. The suicide thing was more concerning. Her death was represented at times as not only logical, but kind of unavoidable in the circumstances, and they didn't really engage with things around mental illness, for example. So that was a good example of us paying a lot of attention to certain things that we know New Zealanders care a lot about, and suicide and sexual violence are right up there. On that one, we actually did end up with an RP classification, RP 18, which was quite unusual. And that was basically acknowledging that the intended audience for that show is often going to be teenagers, but the potential harm of some of that content was quite high. So we were just saying, this is something that parents should be aware of. This is something that there should be some supervision around.
I would say that's appropriate there. 13 Reasons Why is more or less like a high school drama, we say in other words, or at the level like sixth form, sort of like O-level college. And I haven't seen this show in question, but I could imagine quite a lot of the scenes are disturbing. So that would be something you probably want to talk with your younger viewers about, particularly those who are at risk. And, adolescence is a very difficult time, and I'm glad that you made the decision there. I would say this, and I hope no one takes it the wrong way, but the New Zealand film system seems a little bit more, at least into my liking and interest, than the Australian one, because you got the defined age restriction borders that they don't necessarily implicate until they get to the R18 and X18 level, which I think makes sense. That in many ways you're quite similar to Great Britain in that regards, than even Australia or even the Republic of Ireland or Canada and the US. That's just from my experience, but I would definitely agree. I know Don't Breathe was a movie that got a bit of flack for its R18 compared to the MA15 that it receives because of the scene which involves a woman being threatened with sexual assault involving a pipette full of someone's. Well, this is going to have content restrictions. I've put warnings there, but it fills with his ejaculate. But yes, this is not necessarily a family-friendly podcast, but we just want to give warning for those out there. So the next question I have in mind, I always self-censor myself whenever I can. I put 15s and 18s aside to my work. I am a fan of certain titles which have caused quite a lot of trouble with the New Zealand government, particularly like HOSTEL Part 2 and PUNI PUNI POEMY. One is a horror film, one is a Japanese animation, and then I think there was a Belgian cartoon called Shame of the Jungle, Jungle Bird, that was banned in New Zealand when it first came out. I believe all of those works have now been reclassified with a proper rating instead of being banned. So do you know the story on those a little bit?
So I looked into those titles. Each of them has quite a different little interesting story of its own. To start off with, we very rarely ban commercial content like movies, for example. That did happen, back in the day when we had the old chief censor of films would relatively commonly do something, which was, that wasn't unusual in an international context either. When we look at specific titles nowadays, like the ones you've raised, there's also that situation where historical bans, and an example is the Shame of the Jungle one. So something that is classified before our new system came into place, those bans can still be in place, but it's kind of there are ways around that, and it's not always necessarily straightforward. But I'll give the examples you've given give a kind of a nice overview of some of these things. So to talk about HOSTEL Part 2, this is the newest one on the list in terms of things that might have been banned. Again, unusual for us to ban a horror movie like that, but this was also unusual in that it was banning the full movie, but we did say at the time it's actually really about this one scene, which is it was this really highly sexualized scene of torture, and there's parts of our criteria that take that really seriously, and it was seen to promote torture in a way that wasn't acceptable, really. So the decision there was to cut out the scene and that decision later got confirmed on appeal to what's called the Film and Literature Board of Review as well. I think they made slight changes to the timing of the cut, but generally kept it the same. So nowadays that's still in place. It did get released at R18 with that some of that material cut out. And the full film, though, is still banned in New Zealand. As I said, I can't actually think of another example since then that we even have requested cuts. It's very, very unusual, but a good example. The Puni Puni Poemy, I hope I'm actually pronouncing that correctly. So this is a bit earlier, 2004. So that was classified objectionable. That means banned. In 2004, that was also taken to appeal, and the decision was upheld. So this was an interesting one. I looked into it a bit before this interview. So at the time, the office found that it tended to promote the exploitation of children and young people for sexual purposes, and that's another one of those criteria that can lead to a ban that's in our legislation. But this is a really good example of views and changing over time and looking at things from different perspectives. So this one was actually submitted again for classification in 2021. We reevaluated the content, took into account New Zealand's increased familiarity with anime and manga tropes, and the new decision noted that the content has a satirical effect, parodies the kinds of shows that sexualize young characters, and so it's actually calling it out as wrong. So while at the same time the content itself wasn't very explicit. So overall in 2021 we looked at that again, saw that it didn't reach a threshold for a ban, and it ended up actually being classified R16. The final one on the list, Tarzan, so this is older, so that was banned in 1976. The VHS, this was harder. I had to do sort of a bit of digging on here, but the VHS version was classified in R16. It can often get a little bit complex with all the different decisions that might be in place and also different organizations that might make them. But there are those different decisions there. This was all long before our current system was currently set up, and I'm not 100% sure what the status of or whether there might be versions of that are banned or versions that aren't. Basically, at a practical level, though, if someone did want to, say, screen that to New Zealand audiences, they could get it, submit it for classification and get that reconsidered in the same way that Puni Puni Poemy was.
I understand. Well, it's a fairly sort of cult entity. I don't think many people are going to be asking if we could request a copy of that particular film to be re-released. It's certainly not as known about as an adult animation as like Fritz the Cat is, or Akira, Legend of the Overthing, that sort of thing. If it's just me, adult animation tends to be a bit of a curio point as far as censorship is concerned, because it looks like it appeals to children. But I can tell you right now, it certainly doesn't there. And some of the titles that have received R18s, like Kite or Drawn Together, certainly confirm that point of view, at least for the New Zealand film market. If he raises my eyebrow, I remember the days when I couldn't watch South Park growing up. I'm quite a young person, so that explains why. But getting back to other sort of matters on our hands, if you are allowed to within your remit, what are your favourite films and what was your experience with the rating on them and its classification? Say you are a fan of Citizen Kane and it got this and that.
Always a hard question to answer. I am allowed to talk about that. Some of my personal favourite movies are Moulin Rouge, for example, which came out when I was a older teenager. And another one that comes to mind is the recent Dune movie. A big Dune fan of the books, and I thought that was an exceptional movie. I'm not involved in day-to-day classification of films myself, but in terms of looking at them with a classification lens. I have done a lot of that. So I used to present at a high school program. We would watch a film with students and talk through all the criteria we use, and something should be classified. That could mean rewatching a film sort of 5 or 6 times before the end of it. And at that point, it becomes kind of ingrained that you can't look at this film any other way than through this lens of the classifiable content. So yeah, it's quite interesting. But I haven't, my favorite films, I guess I can think of, I haven't been involved in classification around those, which maybe that's a good thing. I'm not sure if that would spoil it or not.
No, it's all right. I mean, for impartiality purposes, I would completely understand. Even I don't work myself necessarily at a film classification board or body. I wish I did. But any film I would see, I'm always very curious to know why it got this rating. And I would always obsess over the little elements or sort of key issues that struck an accord as to why it pushed it to PG or pushed it to 18 or 15. That's just me. I'm a bit weird and nerdy like that, which I'm sure.
I think we're all nerds at this end around that as well, so you're in good company.
I will say this. There was a movie that came out last year called Censor. Primo Bailey Bond directed it. It's from Britain, it's a comedy, it's Welsh. I'm sure when the team reviewed that, because you gave it an R16, you probably thought to yourselves, blimey, fella, it's a little too similar to kind of what we do in our work. Sorry for the accent.
Yeah, I've actually heard about that film, kind of been meaning to watch it, but I haven't got around to it so far. I knew there had been one. Is that kind of around video nasties and so on?
Yes, the whole British moral panic surrounding horror films that are extremely violent and gory, full of rape and stuff. It's a disturbing film. I can see why it's an R16 because it's very self-aware of what it's about, instead of it actually being a video nasty, which probably would have pushed it to R18 by virtue. But that's from my observation.
Yeah, I'll have to give it a look.
Yeah, check it out on your time. See if there's a copy of it at EB Games or something. And then for the next question, the story of Ulysses. I'm sure that's probably a bit of a dark stain on the classification officer's part, because it was a film that was so vulgar, they had to divide it between men and women in cinema auditoriums.
Yeah, so looked at it. That this has come up again. It's kind of it's sort of a bit of an infamous story, I guess. You could think about it because it was quite unusual. Looking into this again before the podcast, I guess come to think of it, I mean, I think it was banned in a lot of other places. So in some ways, the gender segregation thing is obviously a bit obvious, but absurd, really. At the context of the time, other options might have been to actually ban it. So I guess one thing is that they did get to show it. I think looking into this, there's a bit of confusion around it, but I think this was R18 and had those gender segregated audiences. That did happen. You can actually find a picture of the cinema with, like, in black and white, with a rope going down the middle of it, which, I mean, obviously it sounds very crazy to us nowadays looking at it. To my knowledge, I don't think that I don't think there are any other examples of that actually being done. And it's probably seen as a little bit ridiculous even at the time, I think. Yeah.
I could imagine that, but with the conventions of changing cinema attitudes, because the MPAA at the time was becoming more of a tier-based system instead of just censoring films as they come and go. And then Britain had their own classification system, but it was still a bit rigid. So they didn't know quite how to come along with that, with U, A, and X, and then America had G, M, R, and X. So yeah, I could understand why. I think the Americans were quite relaxed about this one. They gave it like an R rating, which you could probably get quite a few things in an R-rated film back then than many other countries, at least at the time. The only countries I know, because I think they said R20, but I know you said R18. That's
What I found on the record, I found it was R18. I've seen other places it being referred to as R20. I'm not 100% sure. It is true that some movies were given R20 in New Zealand. A Clockwork Orange was an example of that. That was pretty rare as well, and those stopped being used in 1994, and they don't apply anymore. It's a good point though about the gradations of classifications and kind of how in many ways those systems allowed more films to get through, because back in the day it used to be that a film would either be allowed or it wouldn't. And I think it was in the 50s in New Zealand that they did bring in those different sort of levels of classification. So that kind of acknowledgement that, okay, this might be okay for adults and not for kids, and let's look at it from that perspective. But even at the time, this gender segregation thing was very unusual. Yeah.
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to haunt anyone who is curious about the system itself, because I know your prime minister is a proud woman, promotes female rights for everyone in New Zealand and also around the world. I know this is kind of getting a little ahead of myself, but has Jacinda Ardern ever visited your offices, or perhaps Julian Dennison from Hunt from the Wilder People, or Taika Waititi, to discuss classification matters?
No, the PM hasn't visited our office. Also, haven't had Taika Waititi. That would be fun. Or yeah, anyone else there. It's pretty unusual to have filmmakers come to the office, and usually the classification process is not being in general that most filmmakers are going to kind of be deeply involved in. It can happen sometimes.
I was just curious a little bit about that, because I know in America, many filmmakers, at least back in the 90s and 2000s, came to the MPAA's office in Los Angeles. Every once in a while, you get a few coming to the BBFC in Great Britain to discuss why my film has an NC-17. I want to get the R rating and get the appeal as I see fit. So I was kind of looking forward to Taika Waititi having a little bit of an argument with the team about, actually not Waititi, Julian Dennison, because he'd gone on about how Deadpool 2 was R16 and he wasn't 16 at the time. So they had to do the Once Upon a Deadpool thing, which was the edited, self-censored version of Deadpool 2 for the Australia and New Zealand markets, and they gave it an M category. Well, I believe an R13. They bumped it up a little bit because there was just a little too much violence or sexual humor for the censor's liking. But that's a bit of a urban legend sort of thing, so I'm not entirely sure. But I will say this on another end as well. This may be a bit controversial. Racial issues. New Zealand's a very diverse country, as is Australia, but I do see there is a bit of a sort of rift between the two countries, because from my experience, Australians seem to be quite relaxed about sort of ethnic and racial stereotyping and not taking into account to other groups that may be in existence. To where something like Jonah from Tonga passed without any sort of blink of an eye in Oz, then over in New Zealand, which has a just very strong cultural Maori population that found the show very offensive. And it is offensive. Did you have any experience with Jonah from Tonga?
I don't. I'm not sure about that one specifically in terms of classification in New Zealand and so on. I'm aware of the show, and obviously, and I am aware of a bit of that controversy around depictions and racism and so on. I would say that obviously that's an important issue. It's something that is, it kind of forms part of our criteria to an extent, but it's not actually something, that kind of offensive content isn't something that we can really, we can put an age restriction on, that kind of thing. It kind of comes down to a freedom of speech position, and the law doesn't allow us to, for example, put an R16 on something because it might have, some kind of stereotyping or that sort of thing. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how that issue is dealt with in Australia. I would say that we definitely do think about cultural diversity a lot when making decisions at the office. It's particularly important when classifying material aimed at specific audiences and, the impact that might have on different audiences. For example, Bollywood films. We recently did research on content harms. We found that, at least at a broad level, people from, all various different backgrounds and communities tend to share similar concerns about things like the things I talked about before, like a lot of concerns about things like sexual violence and suicide, which is something that does affect communities across New Zealand. And overall, people from diverse communities appreciate we could see from that research, they appreciate the official classifications and tend to think we get the balance right. But of course, people aren't always going to agree with that, and which is also why the content warnings are particularly important as well. Because, for example, you could be censored around something like nudity, but it isn't necessarily something we can put an age restriction on. But some people definitely want to be warned about that. So it's an ongoing focus, and yeah, we'll be looking more into that whole, cultural differences and how they impact on classification in future research, I think, as well.
I'm glad that you're doing that, to also encompass as many groups as possible, so they don't have a difficult experience when watching something that they prefer to enjoy with someone who they know who may be of a different background than them, or even a different cultural age group. There's certain things I wouldn't want to watch with my mother, and certainly not my grandmother, or even
good to have those warnings for that situation as well. Yeah,
and even for that matter, because I know a lot of people from the South Asian community, and then people of African diaspora. Certain things are a big absolute no-no. I know within South Asian films like Bollywood, sexual content generally is a bit of a red flag. You just don't show people doing it, or naked bodies. But violence, they generally tend to be a little bit more relaxed about. And then politics can be a real sort of rift. How do I put it that way? Because I know there was a film that came out recently called The Kashmir Files that got really controversial. They said it was offensive to Muslims. They gave it an R18 in New Zealand. I think in some constituencies, particularly in the Middle East, they banned it or heavily censored.
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of where maybe the issues and concerns around the impact or potential harms of something can really, that's related in a large part to different perspectives of people from different communities. So, definitely something that has to be taken into consideration when making classification decisions.
Perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable. I'll give you some more light-hearted questions in this regard. So as far as I'm concerned about, what would you say was the most interesting film or TV show or video game even that you classified during the pandemic? Doesn't necessarily have to be a controversial title, but it can just be one that you thought, oh.
During the pandemic, I was thinking of examples of this. One thing that came to mind was actually a visual album called "If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power" by Halsey. So that was going to screen at IMAX cinemas. This was interesting because it had content like sex, horror, cruelty, violence, dealt with pretty mature themes, so a bunch of the different sorts of things we look at. The depictions of those things weren't particularly strong, but we also knew it could attract a lot of younger viewers who might find some of the content confusing or upsetting. So this ended up with one of those, again, less common restrictions, RP13. So that meant people under 13 could watch it, but they need the support of a parent or caregiver who can talk through some of the issues that were raised with them.
That makes sense. I'm not too familiar with her music, but I could imagine it being quite a bit of a rowdy experience indeed, just like Metallica's films that they sometimes release through big box screens, like through the Never or S&M and that sort of thing. And for young people who are just getting out of university or even comprehensive or high school, what kind of experience do you need to necessarily work at the classification office?
So there's no
key and a bachelor's degree.
Well, it's actually it's pretty flexible, really. There's no kind of hard rules around it. To do classification work, it's certainly a good idea to have a university degree, but in general, people work at the office. We're looking, and we have people from a wide variety of backgrounds and experience. So, for example, we've had doctors and teachers, people with government experience, various other things. We've also had people, come straight out of university or even while they're still studying. So, which is also a more of a push recently to make sure we get at more of a youth perspective as well at the office. So university degree is useful, but it's not a rule. And we also, we don't, it's not required to have people have film industry experience or anything like that as well. So I'd say if people were wondering, well, what should I do if I want to work at the office? There's no one specific type of experience. It's actually we're kind of looking for a diverse group of people. So just say keep an eye out on those job ads.
And then also on another level, this could go both ways. Do you sometimes work with the Australian government as far as classification decisions are concerned, or do you have Australians who work with your office, or even for the people that, for that matter, Americans or British or Canadians? So you gotta be from New Zealand.
No, I mean, in terms of employment at the office, you don't have to. Really thought of it that way, to be honest. But we don't need people to be born and bred Kiwis, anything like that. We do have people from various different places, including at least one person from the UK at the moment. The question around do we work with these other organizations? I wouldn't say that we work directly in terms of individual titles, kind of what might this particular thing be classified as, although we will look into and take into account and kind of look at with interest what another organization might have classified. But we do have relationships with these other organizations in various ways. So keep in touch with people at the BBFC, for example, with Australia as well. When our boss, the chief censor, does overseas trips every so often, it'll often we'll try to get in those meetings as well in person, which can be useful.
I wish I could join those meetings in person myself. I'm sure that must be very interesting to get various perspectives from other parts of the world, be they Anglophone, Oceanic, or even European, North American, I would suppose.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Well, they have those classification kind of international conferences, which I haven't gone to myself, but yeah, it'd be a fascinating experience, I think.
Well, if ever there is one that passes through, feel free to send me like a VIP request to be the journalist or person seeing how it all goes. I'm sure the CNC from France probably has their presence there too, because they're quite an important face. I also speak French, so that helps out a little bit as well. But I believe that's all the questions that we have as far as we're concerned, because I don't want to try to beat the timer on Zoom. They only allow me to do 40 minutes. But I'm very happy to have you on board, Mr. Talbot. I prefer you, to use formal titles, so I won't call you by Henry, but I'll call you Mr. Talbot. And hopefully we talk more further on about the NZ CO, if that's how I can put it, as the classification office. And you take care now. And
Yeah,
also,
thank you. Really interesting chat.
very nice to meet with you too, and I hope to visit your wonderful country sometime in the future.
All right, well, let us know. That sounds great.